August 1945, Yokohama. Japanese civilians were shocked when American soldiers shared their rations with them. A mother braced for the worst. She had taught her son to fear these men. Propaganda promised only brutality. Instead, a corporal from the 11th Airborne knelt down. In his hand was a single square of chocolate. The official rules of war never required this. This mercy was not an order. It was a choice. If victory gives you the power to destroy, why would you choose to feed? Tell us where you're listening from and the exact time there. We want to see how far these testimonies travel. If mercy and memory matter to you, subscribe to keep them alive. In the lingering heat of August 1945, the war had officially ended, but its ghosts remained. On the dusty outskirts of Yokohama, a line of Japanese civilians stood waiting. They were mostly women in worn-out kimonos and small, barefoot children with quiet eyes, their faces smudged with dirt and worry. Hunger had hollowed out their cheeks over months of meager rations, leaving an emptiness that fear was quick to fill. They had heard the Emperor's voice on the radio, announcing the surrender. But that was a sound, an idea. The reality was now walking toward them. American soldiers, the enemy from across the sea, whose arrival had been described in the most terrifying terms imaginable. These were men of the 11th Airborne Division, victors in a brutal war, now the masters of a defeated land. The civilians braced themselves, clutching their children's hands. They had been told what to expect. They waited for the raised rifle, the harsh command, the inevitable cruelty that follows conquest. They did not expect what happened next. There was no shouting, no shoving, no violence. Instead, the soldiers stopped, unslung their packs, and with a quiet efficiency that was itself unsettling, began opening their field ration tins. One American, a young corporal named James Donnelly, stepped forward. He was a boy from a farm in Iowa, with a steady gaze and hands more accustomed to tools than weapons. He carried no grand speech or proclamation, only a simple brown bar of chocolate wrapped in paper. He broke it carefully into small squares, the snap of it echoing in the tense silence. He knelt, so his eyes were level with a small boy who stood frozen beside his mother, and held out a single square. The boy did not move. He only stared, his small body rigid with a fear he did not fully understand, but had been taught to obey. For years, the voice of the state had been the only one he heard. In his schoolbooks, on the radio, in the warnings from his elders, Americans were monsters. They were devils with horns and claws who would bring only pain and dishonor. This man kneeling before him did not look like a monster. He looked tired. His uniform was dusty. He was offering food. The boy glanced at his mother, Aiko Watanabe, searching for a clue. She stood frozen, a silent war waging within her. Pride, honor, and a deep, crushing fear battled against the undeniable sight of her son's hunger. After a long moment, the boy's small hand reached out, trembling, and took the chocolate. He brought it to his lips with the caution of someone touching fire. He took a small bite, and then his eyes widened. For months, his world had tasted of watery millet gruel, of bland rice porridge stretched thin, of the metallic tang of hunger itself. This taste was something else entirely. It was an explosion of sweetness, a rich, powerful flavor that jolted his senses and seemed to fill every empty part of him. It was the taste of a world he had forgotten existed. A small, involuntary gasp escaped him. As he took another, larger bite, his mother watched, and the rigid discipline she had held for so long finally broke. Silent tears began to trace paths through the dust on her cheeks. They were tears of relief, of confusion, of a gratitude so profound and unexpected, it felt like grief. She had prepared herself to die. She had prepared to watch her son suffer. She had never, in all her darkest imaginings, prepared for kindness. A few feet away, a U.S. Army sergeant watched the exchange, a grim look on his face. He nudged the soldier next to him, the words coming out in a low rumble. "This isn't what they told them about us." Standing in the back of the crowd was a schoolteacher, Mrs. Keiko Nakamura. She observed the scene not with a mother's emotion, but with the cold, sharp shock of a professional whose entire world has just been invalidated. Her life was one of order, of facts, of lessons repeated until they became truth. For the past 4 years, she had been a loyal instrument of that truth. She had taught the children in her charge to hate this enemy. She had described American barbarism with words provided by the government, her voice steady and certain, as she painted pictures of the monstrous soldiers who would one day arrive on their shores. She had taught her pupils that surrender was the ultimate shame, a fate worse than death because of the horrors that would surely follow. Now, before her very eyes, that carefully constructed reality was being dismantled by a single piece of chocolate. A thought rose in her mind, sharp and devastating. Everything I taught them about the enemy may have been wrong. It was more than a doubt, it was a crack in the very foundation of her world. The first seed had been planted. In the quiet streets of occupied Japan, this small, unofficial act of sharing food was proving to be more powerful than any imperial decree or military threat. It was a gesture that shattered fear, discredited years of propaganda, and began, bite by bite, the impossible work of ending a war not just on the battlefield, but in the hearts of the people. The individual acts of kindness, like the one in Yokohama, were not happening in a vacuum. They were quiet rebellions against a myth, playing out against a backdrop of official policy and profound fear. The Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, General Douglas MacArthur, had established a clear framework for the occupation. His directives to the hundreds of thousands of USN troops flooding into Japan were strict and unambiguous. Under the authority of SCAP, the occupation government, discipline was the highest priority. There would be no looting of homes, no assaults on civilians, and an enforced respect for the local population and their customs. It was an occupation built on a foundation of restraint, a calculated strategy to win the peace as decisively as they had won the war. But policy is just words on paper. For the average Japanese citizen, the reality they had been prepared for was something far different. For years, relentless government propaganda had insisted that the American GIs were not disciplined soldiers, but savage brutes. They were told the invaders would plunder their homes, desecrate their sacred shrines, and commit unspeakable violence against women and children. The message was so pervasive, so deeply ingrained, that many civilians had made desperate preparations. Women hid small knives in the folds of their kimonos. Families kept vials of poison, ready to end their own lives rather than face the dishonor and torment they were sure was coming. This was the chasm between the myth and the mercy, an official policy of respect clashing with a deeply held belief in impending terror. By September 1945, this tension was most palpable in the hollowed-out heart of the empire, Tokyo. The city was a ruin, and its nearly 4 million remaining inhabitants were on the brink of mass starvation. The war had destroyed supply lines, and the official government rations had dwindled to almost nothing. Daily calorie intake for many fell below 1,500, a level that slowly drains the life from a human body, leaving behind a persistent, gnawing ache and a fog of exhaustion. In this landscape of hunger and fear, the American soldiers arrived, not as monsters, but as a confusing, unpredictable force. On a side street in Yokosuka, a port city bustling with naval activity, Private First Class James Donnelly found himself face to face with this contradiction. He saw an old man, frail and gaunt, leaning against a wall, his dignity the only thing holding him upright. The man's eyes were distant, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. He had likely prepared himself to die with honor rather than beg for scraps from the conquerors. Donnelly, acting on an impulse he didn't fully analyze, opened his own rations and pulled out a small, rectangular can of Spam. He held it out to the man. There was a long pause. The man looked at the can, then at Donnelly's face, searching for a trick, for the cruelty he expected. Seeing none, he slowly reached out and took the offering. Then he bowed, not a simple nod, but a deep, prolonged bow from the waist, a gesture of profound respect and gratitude that seemed to cost him all his remaining strength. That night, Donnelly wrote a few simple words in the small diary he kept in his pocket. They look like us, just hungrier. These small, informal exchanges were happening all across the country. They were not part of any official aid program. U.S. Army field rations were intended for soldiers, but surpluses were common, and many GIs took it upon themselves to distribute them. One supply crate of sea rations, meant for a platoon, could provide a meal for 50 civilians. Reports and letters from the time describe thousands of Hershey bars, tins of Spam, and packets of army biscuits being passed out by ordinary line soldiers, especially to the children who followed them with wide, curious eyes. Officially, the rules of the Geneva Convention, which governed the humane treatment of prisoners, applied only to soldiers, not to the civilian population of a defeated nation. The mercy being shown on the streets was therefore not a matter of protocol, but of personal conscience. Each soldier who shared his food was making a choice, stepping outside the defined roles of victor and vanquished. For the Japanese receiving this help, the experience was deeply disorienting. A mother in Osaka, whose name is lost to history, captured this feeling on a scrap of paper that survived the era. "We waited for punishment," she wrote. "Instead, they gave my son a peach. He laughed for the first time in months." The sound of a child's laughter, a sound that had been absent for so long, became a symbol of this strange new reality, a reality where the enemy did not behave as an enemy at all, and the bitter taste of defeat was inexplicably, unbelievably sweet. The shockwaves from these small encounters rippled outward, forcing a collapse of certainty in minds all across Japan. At a crowded train station in Osaka, the pattern repeated. American GIs, part of the occupying force, moved through the throngs of displaced and hungry people, methodically handing out sea rations from a wooden crate. A teenage boy stood watching from a distance, his face a mask of bitterness. He had lost his father in the final, brutal campaigns in Manchuria, and the grief was still a raw, open wound. He had been taught who to blame, who to hate, and now, the objects of that hate were offering him food. He watched as a soldier handed a can to an elderly woman, who accepted it with a bow so low her forehead almost touched her knees. The contradiction was too much for him to hold inside. He finally muttered, to no one in particular, the question that hung in the air like smoke: "Why feed us if they hate us?" His words, though quiet, were overheard by a U.S. Army chaplain, Lieutenant Robert Hayes, who was overseeing the distribution. Hayes was a calm, deliberate man, his face lined with the weariness of someone who had seen too much death in the Pacific. He approached the boy, not with authority, but with a quiet sense of understanding. He spoke in slow, halting Japanese, his accent thick, but his intention clear. "Because you're alive." The answer was so simple, so devoid of politics or vengeance, that it left the boy speechless. It suggested a different set of rules, a code that operated on a plane of shared humanity that his wartime indoctrination had never acknowledged. This personal crisis of belief was a reflection of a nationwide phenomenon. The entire Japanese system of honor and identity had been built around the idea that surrender was an unthinkable dishonor, precisely because enemy cruelty was a given. The military indoctrination that saturated every corner of civilian life was not just a suggestion, it was presented as an absolute truth. To be captured was to be subjected to torture. To be occupied was to face violation and slavery. This was the lens through which they saw the world. Yet, the reality unfolding on their streets offered a staggering contradiction. As the occupation settled in through late 1945, SCAP authorities began logging official reports. Among the more than 350,000 American troops stationed across Japan, investigators recorded fewer than 50 cases of serious misconduct against civilians. By any historical standard of military occupation, the number was astonishingly, almost impossibly, low. For many Japanese, the collision of these two realities, the brutal enemy of propaganda and the disciplined soldier in front of them, was an unbearable psychological weight. It forced a painful re-evaluation of everything they had been told, everything they had believed. The certainty that had fueled their war effort and steeled them for a bitter end collapsed, not under the force of arms, but under the weight of an unexpected compassion. By the winter of 1945, the first official, large-scale food relief began to arrive in Japan. Shipments of American wheat and powdered milk from U.S. Army stocks were distributed through formal channels, a policy designed to prevent mass starvation and stabilize the country. But for many survivors who lived through that time, these organized efforts were not what they remembered most vividly. The memory that endured, the one that truly marked the end of the war, was smaller and more personal. It was the memory of a single soldier, a single Hershey bar, a single can of Spam offered freely on a dusty road. A widow from a small village outside Hiroshima would later say that for her, the war was truly over not when she heard the emperor's voice on the radio, but when a young American soldier bent down and wordlessly gave her child a piece of chocolate. That simple act communicated more than any treaty or surrender document ever could. It signaled that the cycle of killing was broken. However, this flicker of hope was fragile. Mercy could not feed everyone. By the spring of 1946, despite the formal aid efforts, an estimated 10 million Japanese were still severely undernourished. The GIs who had once handed out their personal rations so freely now faced a grim reality. Their supplies were limited, and the sea of hungry faces was endless. They began to turn civilians away. The same soldiers who had offered kindness now had to refuse it, their faces etched with a different kind of pain. One soldier confessed in a letter home, the words heavy with guilt and helplessness, "It kills me, but I can't feed them all." For the civilians who were turned away, a new and agonizing question arose. Was this mercy they had experienced only a flicker, a temporary and unreliable kindness that could never truly be trusted? In the years that followed the occupation, a strange and complicated silence fell over these moments of mercy. For many of the Japanese civilians who had received American rations, the memory was a source of profound unease. To admit to feeling gratitude toward the occupiers felt like a betrayal of their country, of their ancestors, of the millions who had died fighting against these same men. It was a private shame, a secret kindness that did not fit into the national narrative of defeat and victimhood. How could one reconcile the image of a benevolent soldier with the reality of national subjugation? And so, many people hid the memory away. They did not speak of the chocolate, the Spam, or the peaches. The story of their survival became one of resilience and national spirit, with the role of the foreign benefactor quietly erased. On the other side of the ocean, a similar silence prevailed. The American soldiers who returned home were expected to tell stories of heroism and combat, of battles won and enemies defeated. The quiet, awkward act of handing a piece of candy to a hungry child did not fit into the popular mythology of war. It was too soft, too complicated. It spoke not of victory, but of a shared, uncomfortable humanity. And so, the soldiers, too, often never spoke of it. The stories of war focused on the thunder of artillery and the crackle of gunfire, not the quiet snap of a chocolate bar being broken into squares. The memory of mercy was pushed into the background, an inconvenient footnote in the grand, violent epic of the Second World War. It took decades for these hidden stories to surface. As historians began to dig deeper, moving beyond official records and government reports, they uncovered a trove of personal diaries, private letters, and later, oral testimonies from both Japanese survivors and American veterans. This new body of evidence forced a dramatic re-evaluation of the occupation. It was a story not just of power and policy, but of restraint and personal choice. The seemingly insignificant gift of food emerged as a powerful, recurring symbol. The story of a peach, a bar of chocolate, or a can of Spam became a kind of historical shorthand, a way of understanding a new and unexpected definition of honor. It was the honor not of the victor who crushes his enemy, but of the victor who recognizes his enemy's humanity. Mercy, it turned out, was not just a fleeting emotion, but a strategic force, capable of disarming hatred and laying the groundwork for a future peace that treaties alone could never achieve. The controlling act was not the signing of the surrender on the deck of a battleship, but the simple human transaction on a dusty street. This was the moment the war truly ended for countless individuals, the moment when the possibility of a different future became real. In 1946, as Japan slowly began to rebuild from the ashes, the schoolteacher, Keiko Nakamura, stood before a new class of students. The room was cold, the windows still patched with paper, but the children were no longer hollow-eyed with hunger. They were learning a new history now, one that had to make sense of the incomprehensible events they had lived through. Keiko, who had once taught them to hate, now offered them a different kind of lesson. She told them a simple story, stripped of politics and propaganda. Once, an American soldier gave a hungry boy a peach. Remember this, because mercy can be stronger than war. She spoke from a place of deep, personal transformation, a witness to the collapse of one world and the fragile beginnings of another. Her words were a quiet testament to the profound truth she had discovered in the rubble of Yokohama. For some in Japan, the taste of occupation was not the bitterness of defeat, not the cold steel of boots or bayonets. It was something else entirely. It was the shocking, life-altering sweetness of rations shared.